Good day, I'm McCrindle, and today I'd like to talk to you about One Health and food safety. This is really important because it's the link between healthy animals and healthy food. There's a new definition of One Health. One Health as an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. It recognizes that the health of humans, domestic and wild animals, plants, and the wider environment, including ecosystems, are closely linked and interdependent, as you can see in the little diagram. On the left, you can see the relationship between environment, humans, and animals. At the bottom here, healthy ecosystems and healthy animals, and on the right, rural, urban, and mobile communities, both local and national, where you look at inclusivity, equity, and access. Altogether, you land up with communication, collaboration, coordination, and capacity building, the 4 C's. The World Health Organization has an unwavering commitment to reducing the burden of foodborne illness on global health. In pursuit of continuous improvement in food safety, the World Health Organization was a partner in the first FAO, WHO, and African Union International Food Safety Conference, which was held in Addis Ababa on the 12th to 13th of February 2019. And as you can see from this photograph, all the South African vets who are involved in food safety were there, and yours truly appears right at the back in the corner, right under the golden sun with Africa in the middle. The link on this slide will take you to the full documentation from that meeting. The WHO Global Strategy for Food Safety is shown in the following diagram. I find it a little bit difficult to understand, but it basically says almost the same thing: integrated digital health evidence and prediction, health systems and surveillance, gender, community, equity and ethics, policy, legislation and governance, investment cases and finances, as well as knowledge, integration, and leadership. And the little picture integrates the shared environment of wildlife, companion animals, and agriculture, the shared medicines and medical interventions, as well as safe food and food systems. And it is this little circle on the right at the bottom in the triangle that we're talking about today. Integrated digital health evidence and production of food includes health system surveillance by both veterinarian and medical personnel. You need to have integrated knowledge and leadership. You need to have integrated healthcare and financing. With all this, you have to consider gender, community, equity, and ethics. And eventually, it would lead to better policy, legislation, and governance. There are international role players. These are the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, the International Standards Organization, and the United States Food and Drug Administration, as well as the European Food Safety Authority. And on this particular slide, I have listed the links to these organizations. In South Africa, we have food control and regulatory mechanisms which are aligned to veterinary science through the National Department of Agriculture, the National Department of Health, and the South African Bureau of Standards. And these you'll learn about later, both in veterinary public health and also in veterinary jurisprudence. The part played by the National Department of Agriculture includes the Agricultural Products Standard Act of 1990, the Animal Diseases Act of 1984, the Animal Identification Act of 2000. For example, at the moment we have an example of how that is used in the control of animal diseases, because we're looking at both foot and mouth disease and swine fever. And in the case of swine fever, all pigs that are going to the abattoir have currently got to be identified, which gets a little bit complicated because it's not that easy to put an identification tag on a pig. If you have a group of them, they can pull it out. So people are tending to use a mechanism of writing inside their ears and catching a pig to read what's written inside its ear, and then using ultraviolet light to show you the numbers inside the ear is fairly complicated when you're trying to load or unload 20 or 30 porkers at an abattoir. The Animal Improvement Act, we're always looking at that as well, because resistance to disease is one of the things selected for when you are breeding animals through stud book. The Animal Protection Act, we have to take care that the welfare of animals is always right in the forefront of everything we do as veterinarians. The Fertilizer, Farm Fees, Agricultural Remedies and Stock Remedies Act of 1947 is important, and if I could make a joke about that, at the moment our biggest joke is people using ivermectin, so there's none left to use on sheep and goats, and as a result we have very skinny sheep and goats because we can't deworm them. The Meat Safety Act, that links to the safety of meat in abattoirs, but also safety during the production of meat. The Veterinary and Paraveterinary Professions Act is linked to food safety because there are certain medications which are scheduled under Act 101, and we as veterinarians have access to those medicines, and allowing non-veterinarians and farmers to use these medications has in the past landed up with terribly complicated matters such as antimicrobial resistance and also toxicity and allergies. For example, using penicillin in dairy cows, and that penicillin landing in milk can be a lethal occurrence if that milk is later fed to a baby who's allergic to penicillin. The Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act, this is more about using ISO methods to maintain food security by disinfecting your environment where the food is produced, even at farm level. You can't go around producing food in dirty circumstances. On the other side, the National Department of Health is also involved in the Foodstuff, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act for the very reason, not only for food safety and for food production, but also in places like hospitals and schools, the disinfectants are important. And cosmetics, of course, are also substances which need to have expiry dates and so forth and so on. The National Health Act is particularly pertinent to the production of dairy products, and these are specifically listed under that legislation, and from that you get inspection of dairy farms and dairy animals, etc. International Health Regulations Act links us up to international health regulations internationally. In addition to this, we have the South African, or SABS, South African Bureau of Standards, and they, for every kind of animal foodstuff, have put together norms or a list of the proper ways to do things. Fairly recently, I was involved in the SPCA putting through standards for the dairy industry as to how you should manage animal welfare in dairy. This is under the jurisdiction of the Department of Trade and Industry because those legislated standards must be in line with the import and export control of foodstuffs of animal origin. One of the things we have to look at is what we call a food supply chain. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a diagram which says we start with monitoring the environment. That leads to farming and animal husbandry. The next step in the food supply chain is how you harvest the food, how you process it, how you transport it and distribute it, preparation and consumption. So we need standards at each of these different steps, and the veterinarian is intricately involved in the environment in which food of animal origin is produced. We are the ones who are looking at whether the animals are healthy. We are the ones that are maintaining animal welfare and feeding practices which are to the advantage of both humans and animals and the environment. We are also leaders in the field of farming of domestic animals and their husbandry. We supervise the harvesting of these animals or their products. For example, we supervise dairies and milk parlours. We supervise abattoirs. The processing is a little bit out of our realm, but if you are working in veterinary public health, you talk about HACCP, which is Hazard Assessment and Critical Control Points. And although we're not directly involved in processing, we are involved at the points of entry and exit of foodstuffs that are being imported and exported in our country to make sure that the processing these foodstuffs went through was in the interests of the health of our population and does not introduce infectious diseases which might break out and hurt our domestic animals in South Africa. These food chains that I have illustrated on the right-hand side have different types. Firstly, there is the formal food chain. This is organized agriculture, and the formal food chain is supervised from the beginning to the end through legislation. There are national and international legislated norms for food safety and quality. For example, the European Union will not import oranges from South Africa unless they conform absolutely to international standards for quality of oranges. The same goes for milk and meat and fish and any other products of animal origin. Then we look at our own internal rules and regulations that are legislated, and a very good example of that is that we don't want to import foodstuffs which could transmit disease. We have in the past, not so much in our country, in other countries, imported pork and found out that it carried foot and mouth disease. And when that pork was cut up in a butchery and the bits and pieces were thrown out for feral pigs to eat, you have an outbreak of foot and mouth disease. In contrast to the legislated formal food chain, we have an informal food chain, which may be legal or illegal, but it does not conform to international standards of food safety and quality. So that's what we call an informal food chain. And we allow that in South Africa because we have a lot of informal settlements. We have a lot of small-scale informal agriculture. And if somebody in a township is growing beetroot in their backyard, they can sell it to the person next door. If their hens are laying eggs, they might just sell them on a Saturday at the informal market down the street in the informal township. And because that is a human right in South Africa, the right to life, we allow these things to happen without the rigid controls which are sometimes the case in places like Europe. However, one thing about informal food chains is often they go directly from the producer to the consumer. And because there are not a lot of steps along the way, the food at the end of the process is much healthier. So we are talking about human health and animal health and the One Health concept. So when we look at a food chain, this ties in very well with the whole idea of One Health. Let's look at the long food chain. The long food chain starts with the livestock farmer. And there's got to be some quality control. Use a vet, go there and you test the animals for brucellosis, etc., etc. So now the animals have to go to an auction. So you've got to make sure that the herd of pedigreed Friesians has been tested for all infectious diseases and certified as being healthy before they're allowed to go and be auctioned. So there's quality control for that as well. They also have to be numbered and carry identification tabs. From the auction, they may be sold to the abattoir. In the abattoir, there is also a quality control. As they go through the abattoir, you will see, for example, with tuberculosis, that when you inspect the animal, you'll find tubercular nodules on the lungs, and those tubercular nodules are a quality control. We cannot let that meat go out for human consumption. From the abattoir, it goes to the retail butcher. And the retail butcher, when he's looking at the meat he's purchased, he will look it over and say, is this meat okay? And there are also inspectors that come and inspect butcheries and make sure that their refrigeration is right and that they're hanging the meat right and that there's a sell-by date on meat that is bought from the abattoir. And eventually, the end user is the consumer, and the consumer can have personal quality control, but much of the food that we put onto the shelves in a supermarket, even a piece of steak in a little plastic box with a bit of plastic over it, will give you a temperature, advised temperature at which you have to keep the food, and it'll have a sell-by date. And it will certify that this particular piece of meat was produced in a registered facility, and there's a certification number at the bottom. So if you eat a nice big piece of steak that you got from Pick and Pay or Woolworths, and you go home and you braai it and you come down with some horrible disease and you're trying to blame the steak, you can trace it back through that little label. You can trace it all the way back to the farm from which it originated. However, because there are so many little places where the quality control is needed, one slip in one of these will result in the whole product being infected or substandard. And we do find this in reality, especially when we're importing food. There's substitution of food. In the past, we've had beef that was substituted with the meat of horses, old race horses and polo ponies who had various drugs in them and were slaughtered in Poland and slipped into the food chain to come and be imported into South Africa as coming from the EU with a stamp on it that said beef. The short food chain, which a lot of people turn their noses up at and say, well, this is a substandard way of producing feed, is often much safer because the consumer themselves has the power to decide whether or not they want to use this product. So you've got the farmer who produces the fat lamb and he slaughters it and he and his family eat it. Or perhaps he sells it to the man next door who slaughters it and eats it for supper. So you've only really got one level of quality control, and that's when the purchaser goes to the farmer who's his next door neighbor and he says, well, that's a nice fat little male sheep. I'm going to take that one, or goat. Maybe it's a goat. We're in an informal settlement. Let's make it a goat. That little goat there, who I want to eat for supper, looks healthy and he's chewing his food up nicely and he's nice and fat and he's walking well and he's not lame. He's got a bright eye, and I'm going to take him home and cut his throat and turn him into goat stew for my family to have on the weekend. So this informal market, especially in sort of the village system where people know each other, becomes a system which allows for good food safety within the One Health concept. So I'm giving some examples of food chains in South Africa in the poultry industry, and I selected the photograph because we're talking about a food chain, and I'd say these broilers hanging up by their legs at the abattoir, having been slaughtered and defeathered, are all held together by a chain, which gives you a really good visual picture of what a long food chain looks like. So these broiler chicken carcasses are produced in a registered facility that obeys all the rules and regulation and legal constraints that are needed for the production of broiler carcasses in South Africa and internationally. They were slaughtered after production at a registered facility, they are slaughtered at a registered abattoir, and there is value-added processing. In other words, the value added is that they are cooled and later they are soaked in salt water, and these things add value because they prevent them going bad quickly on their way to be sold at Pick and Pay. So that is a formal chain. The short chain or informal market has got broiler production in somebody's backyard, and then on Saturday they take these chickens, 6 of them in a little cage, and they go to the local informal market, and there they've got the chickens, and it's a wet market. In South Africa we don't do wet markets. The rest of Africa does wet markets, which means they sell those broilers live. We tend to sell slaughtered broilers. In fact, they don't really like us even selling slaughtered broilers at an informal market. So mostly our informal short-term chain informal markets for small-scale producers are the auctioning of live animals at an auction sale. And those animals or birds have got to be identified, and the place from which they have come. Even if it's a backyard, we need the name, address, and telephone number of the producer. We also have what we will call a crossover, where there is broiler production at a registered abattoir. They slaughtered at a registered abattoir, and then the marler is sold at the abattoir door to small-scale informal traders, because marler is a traditional kind of food. It's got intestines all full of feces, so technically speaking, it's far too dirty looking for anyone in Europe to ever want to eat it. In South Africa, we have traditional ways of washing it out and fixing it up and cooking it in a way which is perfectly safe for the consumer. So therefore, many abattoirs have a place at the abattoir door where fresh marler that's been taken out of slaughtered commercial chickens can be sold to informal. When you do these long food chains and you slaughter an abattoir, you have to monitor the facilities and equipment right along the food chain. So here I have an example of waste. This was taken at an abattoir which looked gorgeous, and then you went along and you found this sort of thing outside. The dustbins were full of condemned poultry meat, and the flies and the cockroaches and goodness knows what else, the birds and feral cats and everything else was running in and out of there. There'd even been feral dogs that dug a hole onto the fence and dragging half decomposed chicken bodies and marler all over the place. So that in itself was a way that you were compromising the health and safety of the people who live around the abattoir. So your flow of work has got to be neat and tidy and controlled from beginning to end. You have to look at the materials used. This here, a whole bunch of discarded plastic bags full of chicken remains. As a person, I just look at that and feel a little bit uncomfortable. And materials used there, those second-hand feed bags, are certainly not acceptable. The maintenance of the area is very poor. There's weeds and grass, and the fence is not maintained. The water quality, when the stuff falls on the ground and it rains, that water is going to flow out of the abattoir premises and land up in the underground water somewhere, and it's going to compromise the underwater water, and that is what we would call effluent. So we process along the chain. We've got these steps along the food chain, all of which involve processing and monitoring of safety. At the receiving end of the abattoir, for example, or the market, you have to have quality control on the product, and you have to know where it comes from. With the storage, you've got to look at temperature and rodent control and time. When you start mixing the ingredients, you've got to look at cooking and cooling, and you've got to measure time and temperature and testing. When you've got the packaging, you've got to check and audit the control of the packaging and look at the quality. For dispatch and transport, again, you've got to look at disinfection of the area, container size, loading protocol, and many times also temperature. At the end product for the sale, you have an expiry date and a little label. So if you look at this here and you mentally picture you're going to go to Pick and Pay and you're going to get a little packet with 10 chicken wings in that. original chicken wings were found at the abattoir. They were stored at the abattoir in a plastic bag. They were sent to somebody else who cut them all up into neat little sections and repacked them. The packaging had to be controlled. They sent this little package off to Pick n Pay, and you came along on a Saturday morning, looked at the fridge in Pick n Pay, and you found this little packet of chicken wings with an expiry date. So your end product quality and safety assessment looks at a label, and on the label you have the composition with nutrition and ingredients. What is the protein content, etc., etc. What's the shelf life? It has an expiry date. If necessary, we'll look at process inputs and outputs. Where does this come from and where's it going to? There are intrinsic control parameters, which are also looked at with the safety. For example, if the packaging is slightly leaking and on a little bag or a little packet in Pick n Pay that's got chicken wings in it, and there's a bit of a hole and one of the chicken wings is hanging out over the edge of the packet, you're not going to buy it. The transport conditions, are they sent in a refrigerated truck or they're packed on the back of a wheelbarrow? And then you measure the expected changes in the food, the biological, chemical, and enzymic changes. In other words, are those chicken wings in the little packet turning green? And do they smell a bit? And is there gas under the plastic? And then we look at sources of contamination, which can be biological, such as bugs, chemical, if somebody spills something like Jik all over it, and physical, if someone sort of trips over one of these packets and puts a great big muddy boot into the middle of the packet of chicken. Right, so now having said all that, to see if you understand it, I'm showing you a typical informal trader, and as though you can't really see it, he is cooking chicken pieces over an open fire at a taxi stop. So now I'm going to ask the questions here. This young man, I think it might be a young man, it might be a young lady, but I think it's a young man, gets up at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and he goes along to the chicken abattoir, and he gets the heads and feet of the chickens. And he brings them home, presumably in that little freezer bag that you see hanging on the edge of his vendor shop. So I've given you the answer to some of the questions, and I'd like you just to perhaps come together and discuss now amongst yourselves, who is this? What is it? Who is the producer? Who is the vendor? What is being marketed? But I told you it's heads and feet of chickens. Is this a short or long food chain? Are the food safety risks for this little vendor high or low? What legislation is involved? And if you looked at this from a One Health perspective, where human and animal health and gender and equity and all those things we talked about in slide 1 are involved, what is the perspective on this? Amongst those things we talked about are ethics, equity, food security, integrated health systems, and environmental health systems. Just as a partial help, South African regulations for the slaughter of poultry not at an abattoir for own consumption include that a person may not in a 14-day period for own consumption slaughter more than 25 units of poultry. Slaughter of poultry not in an abattoir for religious purposes of the Muslim faith is permitted. Slaughter of poultry not in an abattoir for indigenous, religious, or cultural purposes is permitted. And ritual slaughter of poultry in abattoir is permitted. Does this little story conform to that? Some references, a definition of One Health 2021, Garcia et al. 2020, One Health for Food Safety, and Nchibeli, South Africa's Food Safety Regulatory System and Injury Standards.